When you were up there, at 19,000 feet, what was the moment you realized something had gone wrong?
I felt the weight drop, and the rope went tight. In that moment, I thought we were both going to die.
I can't hold you! The rope, it's slipping! Ah! Ah!
I kept thinking, if he was still alive down there, he'd be waiting for me. And I had to keep moving. By then, he wasn't crawling toward rescue. He was crawling toward hope, because it was the only thing left. Somewhere up there, a part of him never truly came back. But he survived, and that was enough.
The sound was not dry like a gunshot, nor was it clean like the snapping of a branch. It was the sickening, wet crunch of structural failure, a muffled implosion of calcium and marrow that vibrated through the air like a low-frequency hum. Julian felt the vibration before the pain registered, a terrible grinding sensation traveling up his shin and exploding into his hip. One moment he was traversing the icy traverse of Siula Grande's west face, and in the next, the world had tilted on its axis, gravity reclaiming him with a violent, indifferent hand. His cramp had skidded on a patch of invisible black ice, sending his entire body weight crashing down onto a protruding anvil of granite, forcing the tibia to absorb kinetic energy it was never designed to withstand. The scream that tore from his throat was primal, a ragged expulsion of air that instantly froze into a cloud of crystals before his face. Above him, Elias felt the shockwave travel through the nylon rope connecting them. It hit his harness with the force of a sledgehammer, nearly ripping him from his own precarious stance on the ridge. He slammed his axe into the fern, the metal singing as it bit deep, his muscles screaming against the sudden deadweight dragging him toward the abyss. The rope went bar-taut, humming with tension, a lifeline suddenly transformed into a potential suicide pact. Elias gritted his teeth, the enamel grinding together as he fought the physics of the fall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that burned his lungs like inhaling broken glass. Julian swung helplessly in the void, suspended by the harness that dug into his ribs. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding white light behind his eyes that drowned out the wind, a nausea so profound that he gagged, dry heaving into the thin air. He looked down at his leg. It hung at a grotesque, impossible angle, the lower limb swinging independently of the knee, a marionette with its strings cut. The realization hit him harder than the rock had. This was not an injury. This was a death sentence. Then, the mountain inhaled. The ambient temperature plummeted, stripping 20 degrees from the air in a matter of seconds as the brewing storm finally crested the peak. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple, swallowing the sun and plunging them into a twilight gloom. Ice crystals began to scour Julian's exposed cheeks, stinging like sandblasting grit. He was 19,000 feet in the air, dangling over a kilometer of vertical drop, with a leg that had just been reduced to a bag of gravel. The cold began to seep into the break, a deep, gnawing ache that competed with the sharp fire of the fracture. Survival was no longer a matter of skill. It was a matter of calculus, and the math was terrifying. The adrenaline that had initially surged through Elias's veins, a chemical tide that masked the cold and the fear, had long since evaporated, leaving behind a residue of hollow, trembling exhaustion. He was no longer a climber. He was a human winch, a biological machine pitted against the relentless pull of gravity. He had dug a bucket seat into the powdery snow, burying his oxes deep to create a psychological sense of security, but the physics were undeniable and cruel. With every foot of rope he paid out, the weight of Julian's broken body transmitted directly into his own skeletal structure, compressing his spine and grinding his hips against the unyielding nylon of his harness. The rope was a living thing in his hands, a vibrating tendon connecting the living to the dying. Through the thick leather of his gloves, the friction generated a scorching heat that seemed to defy the sub-zero air surrounding them. Elias could feel the texture of the braided sheath sliding through his belay device, a stuttering, jerky rhythm that required absolute concentration. If he let go, Julian died. If he held too tight, Julian froze. The calculation ran on a loop in his mind, a mantra of survival that kept the encroaching panic at bay. His mouth was a desert, his tongue swelling against the roof of his palate, the saliva turning into a sticky paste that made swallowing an act of labor. Below him, the descent was not a graceful slide, but a series of violent collisions. Julian had become a helpless pendulum, suspended over the void by a lifeline that felt increasingly like a noose. With every gust of the erratic mountain wind, his body was swung away from the face and then slammed back against the vertical ice. He could not fend himself off. The shattered architecture of his leg rendered him incapable of absorbing the impact. Each time he struck the wall, the vibration traveled up the rope, a sickening tug that nearly pulled Elias from his stance. Julian didn't scream anymore. He didn't have the oxygen for it. He simply emitted low, guttural grunts, the sound of an animal resigning itself to the slaughter. Elias watched the knot at the end of the rope inch closer to his device. 300 feet. He had to lower him 300 feet, build a new anchor, climb down, and do it all over again. The physical toll was turning catastrophic. The harness cut deep into Elias's waist, pinching nerves and cutting off circulation to his legs, creating a sensation of pins and needles that warred with the biting frost. His back muscles seized in agonizing spasms, rigid knots of tension that threatened to lock him in place. He wasn't just fighting the weight of his partner, he was fighting the weight of the mountain itself. The air was so thin that every movement required a deliberate, conscious effort, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, struggling to pump sludge-thick blood through his dehydrated veins. Then the light began to fail. It didn't fade gently. The sun simply dropped behind the jagged sawtooth ridge of the refined horizon, extinguishing the world like a blown candle. The transition was instant and brutal. The gray ice turned black, and the temperature plummeted into numbers that the human mind struggled to comprehend. The wind picked up, howling through the coal, stripping the remaining warmth from Elias's core. He looked down into the abyss where Julian dangled, a small, dark shape swallowed by the immense shadow of the Siula Grande. They were alone in the dark. The collapse was not dramatic. It was terrifyingly quiet. The bucket seat Elias had meticulously carved from the slope simply disintegrated, the powder turning to granulated sugar under the relentless pressure of the load. There was a sickening lurch, a sensation of the earth vanishing beneath his boots, and then he was airborne. He fell 10 feet before the rope snapped taut, slamming his chest into the ice with the force of a sledgehammer. The air was driven from his lungs in a single agonizing wheeze, leaving him gasping against the frozen crust. He clawed frantically at the slope, his gloved fingers scraping uselessly against the bulletproof rime, but the physics had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer anchored. He was merely a counterweight, held in place only by the friction of the rope over a jagged lip of rock and the desperate, failing grip of his crampon points. He was hanging by his fingertips. Time warped into a distorted, agonizing loop. For an hour, he held the position, his muscles screaming as the lactic acid built up to intolerable levels, burning through his shoulders like molten lead. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that erased the horizon and reduced his world to the 3 feet of ice directly in front of his face. The cold was no longer an external environment. It was an invasive parasite burrowing into his extremities. He could feel the frostbite claiming his fingers, a creeping numbness that started at the tips and moved relentlessly toward his palms, turning his flesh into something wooden and foreign. Below him, the rope remained pulled tight as a piano wire, vibrating with the dead weight of the man who was killing them both. Julian was silent now. The silence was worse than the screaming. It implied a finality, a grim acceptance that the mountain had won. Elias tried to shout, but his throat was frozen shut, his lips cracked and bleeding. The calculation in his mind shifted from survival to execution. He replayed the scenario with the cold detachment of a coroner.
If he tried to climb up, the movement would dislodge his precarious hold, and they would both plummet 3,000 feet to the glacier. If he stayed, the cold would eventually shut down his heart, and they would freeze in tandem. 2 corpses tethered together for eternity. There was no rescue coming. There was no miracle in the wind. There was only the mathematics of weight and the finite limit of human endurance. He reached for the knife. The movement was clumsy, his frozen hands fumbling with the carabiner on his harness like he was wearing oven mitts. He couldn't feel the metal. He had to rely on the visual confirmation of his headlamp to know his fingers were wrapped around the handle. He brought the blade up. It was a small, serrated piece of steel, pitifully small against the enormity of the dark, but it was the only tool left in the universe that mattered. He looked at the rope. The nylon fibers stretched so taut they looked like solid plastic, shimmering with ice crystals under the beam of his light. He didn't think about Julian as a friend or a partner or a father. In that moment, Julian was just mass. He was just drag. Elias pressed the blade against the tension. The resistance was immense. The nylon didn't slice easily. It required a sawing motion, a deliberate and violent act of severance. He could feel the vibrations traveling up the handle of the knife, a gritty, high-frequency shudder as the individual strands began to part. First, the sheath gave way, curling back like peeled skin, exposing the white core strands beneath. He sawed harder, his breath hitching in his chest, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. One strand snapped with a dull thwip, then another. The structural integrity of the lifeline was unraveling inches from his face, the rope groaning under the torture. Then came the release. It wasn't a sound, but a kinetic explosion. The remaining strands failed all at once, the tension vanishing from the system with the violence of a gunshot. Elias was thrown backward against the ice, the sudden absence of weight causing his body to recoil violently into the mountain.
The severed end of the rope whipped away into the darkness, sneaking out of sight in the blink of an eye. There was no scream from below, no sound of impact, just the terrifying, expansive silence of the void swallowing the falling mass. Elias lay pressed against the ice, gasping, the knife still clutched in his deadened hand, listening to the wind reclaim the silence where his friend used to be. Consciousness returned not as a flood, but as a slow, agonizing reassembly of shattered, jagged pieces. The first thing Julian noticed was the absence of the wind. The roaring gale that had been trying to scour them from the face of the mountain was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He opened his eyes, but the world was a kaleidoscope of spinning cobalt and white. He tried to inhale, but his ribs locked up, a sharp, serrated pain stabbing through his chest wall with every shallow breath. He was lying on his back, staring up at a narrow slit of gray sky, framed by towering, translucent walls that stretched up endlessly, vanishing into a haze of spindrift far above. He was in the belly of the glacier. The crevasse was a cathedral of ancient, compressed ice, glowing with a bioluminescent blue light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was beautiful in the way a coffin is beautiful, pristine, silent, and final. The temperature here was distinct from the exposed face. It wasn't the biting, wind-driven freeze of the ascent, but a stillness that sucked the heat from his core through the layers of his suit. He lay on a wedged block of debris, a fragile bridge caught between 2 converging walls of the chasm, suspended over a darkness that went down to the bedrock of the world. The air tasted metallic, thick with the scent of ozone and the copper tang of his own blood filling his mouth. He tried to sit up, and the nausea hit him with the force of a physical blow. The contents of his stomach emptied onto the pristine ice, steaming in the frigid air. His head swam with the distinct gummy vertigo of a severe concussion, the world tilting on a sickening axis.
He looked down at his legs. The left one was twisted at an angle that defied anatomy, the knee swollen tight against the fabric of his snow pants. He couldn't feel the toes. He couldn't feel the shin. There was only a dull, distant throbbing, a warning signal from a nervous system that had gone into emergency shutdown to prevent him from passing out from the agony. His hand drifted to his waist, seeking the reassurance of the tether. His thick, gloved fingers brushed the knot at his harness, tracing the line outward. It should have been tight. It should have led up to Elias, to safety, to the anchor. Instead, the rope ended abruptly 2 feet from his waist. Julian blinked, wiping the grit from his eyes to focus on the end of the line. It wasn't frayed. It hadn't snapped under the load. The nylon core was white and clean, severed with a surgical precision that left no room for interpretation. The realization hit him harder than the fall. He looked up toward the distant slit of light, the only connection to the living world. The walls of the crevasse were smooth as polished glass, offering no purchase, no friction, no hope. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse the man who had cut him loose, but the sound died in his throat, absorbed instantly by the millions of tons of porous ice surrounding him. Above, the cut end of the rope dangled in the periphery of his vision, swaying gently in a draft he couldn't feel, mocking him like a pendulum counting down the remaining minutes of his life. He was a specimen in a jar, waiting to expire. The walls above him were not merely steep. They were architectural impossibilities sculpted by wind and time. Julian ran a gloved hand over the translucent blue surface, feeling the seamless glass-like texture that offered zero friction. To climb up with a shattered knee and a concussion was a fantasy reserved for the dying. The overhangs bulged out like frozen waves ready to break, blocking the sliver of gray sky that mocked him from 1,000 feet up. Survival logic, cold and binary, began to override the panic fluttering in his chest.
If the ascent was a guaranteed tomb, the descent was the only variable left in the equation. He had to go deeper into the throat of the glacier, gambling on the geological probability of a drainage tunnel at the bedrock. He unclipped the single ice screw remaining on his harness, its metal teeth dull against the twilight gloom of the crevasse. It was a terrifyingly small piece of metal to entrust with his life. With trembling hands, he cleared a patch of rime on the wall next to his precarious perch, jamming the tip of the screw into the hard blue ice. He turned it. The resistance was immense, sending fresh shockwaves of nausea through his gut as his ribs grated against one another. He gritted his teeth, forcing the metal deeper, turn by agonizing turn until the hanger was flush against the wall. The ice groaned under the pressure, a deep resonant complaint that vibrated through his gloves. He threaded the rope through his belay device, the metallic click echoing too loudly in the confined space. Pushing off the debris ledge required a surrender of instinct that felt akin to suicide. He allowed his weight to transfer onto the harness, the nylon stretching taut with a sickening lurch that pulled at his bruised hips. He swung out into the void. The walls of the chasm immediately narrowed, pressing in on him like the closing covers of a book. The bioluminescent blue light that had illuminated his crash site began to fade, strangled by the sheer density of the ice above. He was rappelling into the throat of the world. Darkness didn't fall, it rose up to swallow him. Within 30 feet, the ambient light was extinguished completely, plunging him into a heavy, suffocating blackness that erased the horizon. His headlamp was dead, shattered in the fall, leaving him to navigate by touch and terror alone. The air temperature plummeted, biting through his thermal layers with a damp, predatory chill that felt distinct from the dry cold of the surface. Here, the air was stagnant, smelling of ancient dust and trapped minerals, preserved for millennia and released only now to fill his lungs. He hung suspended in the void, spinning slowly on the line.
Without visual reference, his vestibular system began to fail. He couldn't tell how far he was from the walls, or if the floor was 5 feet or 500 feet below. The silence was broken only by the sound of water, distant, rhythmic dripping that echoed off unseen surfaces like the ticking of a doomsday clock. It was the sound of the glacier sweating, a reminder that this mountain was alive and shifting. Every drop magnified the vastness of the space around him, a cavernous, hollow emptiness that made him feel microscopic. His grip on the brake hand tightened until his knuckles ached. He was feeding the rope through the device inch by inch, terrified of the moment the tension would vanish. If the rope ended before his boots touched solid ground, he would be stranded in this hanging purgatory, dangling in the absolute dark until hypothermia stopped his heart. He kicked out blindly with his good leg, seeking a wall, a ledge, anything solid, but his boot met only empty, freezing air. The end of the rope was coming. He could feel the weight of the tail diminishing in his hand. The rope ran out. The knot at the end of the line jammed into his belay device, jerking him to a halt with a violence that rattled his teeth. Julian kicked out, expecting the void, but his boot struck something hard and slick. It wasn't flat ground, it was a steep, funnel-like depression of polished ice, curving downward into the mountain's throat. He released the tension, collapsing onto the slope, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps that fogged instantly in the stagnant air. He lay there for a moment, the silence of the deep glacier pressing against his eardrums, heavier than the darkness itself. He unclipped the carabiner, severing his last physical connection to the surface world. The only way forward was a narrow aperture at the base of the funnel, a smooth, cylindrical tunnel carved by centuries of seasonal meltwater. It was a geological intestine, barely wider than his shoulders, twisting away into the blackness.
Terrified, his body toward the opening, the shattered bones in his knee grinding together with a sensation like gravel being crushed in a mortar. Entering the tunnel required a complete surrender of dignity. He had to lie flat on his belly, arms extended, and pull himself into the ice like a worm burrowing into frozen earth. The cold here was not an ambient temperature. It was a physical weight. As he shimmied deeper into the corkscrew, the walls pressed in, stealing the heat from his shoulders and hips through his torn flight suit. The ice was terrifyingly smooth, sculpted to a glass-like finish that offered no purchase for his hands, forcing him to rely on friction and desperation to inch forward. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and ancient trapped dust, a flavor that had not existed in the atmosphere since the last ice age. Then the walls constricted. Julian stopped, his chest wedged tight against the ceiling and floor of the chute. He exhaled, trying to make himself smaller, but his ribcage scraped against the unyielding blue walls. Panic, sharp and electric, spiked in his brain. He was trapped 1,000 feet beneath the surface, corked in a bottle of ice. His breath quickened, stealing the limited oxygen in the cramped space, and he felt the crushing tonnage of the glacier above him, millions of tons of compacted snow, waiting to settle just a fraction of an inch and turn him into a fossil. He tried to push backward, but gravity and the angle of the chute fought him. He was committed. His shoulders were too broad for the pinch point. The binary logic of survival presented him with a sickening calculation. The geometry of the tunnel would not change, so the geometry of his body had to. He gritted his teeth, tasting the copper tang of blood where he'd bitten his tongue. He jammed his left arm into a small fissure in the ice ahead, using it as a fulcrum. He needed to make his shoulder girdle collapsible. He twisted his torso violently against the leverage of his trapped arm. A wet, sickening pop echoed in the confined space.
The pain was blinding, a white-hot spear that drove through his deltoid and exploded behind his eyes, momentarily erasing the cold. His left shoulder slumped forward, unnaturally low, disconnected from the socket. Nausea rolled over him in a suffocating wave, but the width of his frame had been reduced by the necessary 3 inches. He screamed, but the sound died instantly, swallowed by the ice. With his left arm dangling uselessly and his right leg dragging like a sack of wet sand, he slithered through the constriction. The ice scraped against his face, stripping skin from his cheekbone, but he pushed through the agony, fueled by the primal terror of suffocation. He emerged from the pinch point, tumbling forward into a slightly wider chamber, gasping for air that smelled of wet rock and deep, unrelenting winter. He was deeper now, broken and dismantled, but he was still moving. The darkness ended not with a gradual graying, but with a violent assault of white. Julian tumbled out of the glacial mouth and onto a surface that felt less like earth and more like a pile of discarded razors. The transition was immediate and brutal. After hours in the crushing gloom of the corkscrew, the high-altitude sun struck him with the force of a physical blow, searing his retinas the moment his eyelids fluttered open. He squeezed them shut instantly, tears streaming down his crime-streaked face, but the after-image burned behind his eyelids, a throbbing red-white blotch that refused to fade. He lay panting on the slope, waiting for his vision to adjust, but when he finally cracked his eyes again, the world remained a washed-out overexposure. He was in the moraine now, the glacial graveyard where the ice vomited up the mountains it had slowly digested over millennia. There was no snow here, only an endless, undulating ocean of gray rock. From house-sized boulders to fist-sized stones, everything was jagged, raw, and precariously balanced. It was a landscape of arrested motion, millions of tons of granite waiting for a single vibration to resume their slide into the abyss.
Julian tried to shift his weight, and the ground beneath him groaned.
The scree shifted like liquid, 1,000 sharp stones grinding against one another with a sound like teeth chewing on glass. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was not the solid, predictable danger of the ice. This was chaos mechanics. He couldn't crawl here. The granite shards would shred his remaining flesh to ribbons, and he certainly couldn't walk. He had to crab scramble, using his one good arm and his one good leg to hoist his broken body over the jagged terrain. He lurched forward, dragging his shattered right leg behind him like dead weight. The movement sent a fresh spike of nausea through his gut as the heavy boot caught on a protrusion of slate. The flight suit, already compromised, finally gave way at the knee. He felt the sickening scrape of raw skin against sandpaper rough granite, a friction burn that layered a hot, stinging agony over the deep, throbbing ache of the bone fracture. Every yard gained was paid for in fabric and epidermis. The air temperature was still well below freezing, yet he felt as though he were burning alive. At this altitude, the atmosphere was too thin to filter the ultraviolet radiation. It cooked the exposed skin on his neck and face, turning the sweat freezing on his brow into a chemical sting that dripped into his eyes. The glare was unrelenting, bouncing off the gray rocks and amplifying the light until the world lost all definition. He wasn't navigating by sight anymore. He was navigating by the texture of pain under his hands. He reached for a slab of gray rock to pull himself up a steep embankment, his fingers searching for a hold. As he applied weight, the boulder, weighing perhaps 300 pounds, tilted with a dry, grinding rasp. The ground dropped out from under him. He scrambled backwards desperately as the rock tumbled away, crashing down the slope with a deafening roar that shook the scree field, triggering a cascade of smaller stones. Julian lay flat, spread-eagled on the shifting pile, breathing in dust that tasted of crushed minerals and defeat. He was out of the ice, but the mountain was still trying to eat him, one stone at a time.
The physical torture of the scree field eventually gave way to a far more insidious brutality. The agony in Julian's shattered leg had become a dull, rhythmic background noise, eclipsed entirely by the screaming void in his throat. Thirst was no longer a signal sending urgency to his brain. It was a physical entity, a parasite that had replaced his tongue with a swollen, immobile slug of dead meat. The saliva had thickened into a glue that sealed his airway shut every time he forgot to breathe through his nose, forcing him to hack dry, rasping coughs that tasted of iron and dust. The landscape began to glitch. The stark definition of the gray granite softened, the edges blurring into a watery shimmer that defied the freezing air temperature. He blinked, expecting the distortion to clear, but the world refused to reset. Ahead, perhaps 300 yards across a flatter expanse of wind-scoured basalt, a shape materialized from the heat haze. It was angular, geometric, and impossibly beautifully orange. Ripstop nylon. The realization hit him with the potency of a narcotic. It was a tent, a North Face survival dome, anchored against the wind, the fabric rippling gently. He didn't just see it, he felt the phantom texture of the zipper pulls between his fingers. His logic center, usually a fortress of cynicism, crumbled instantly under the weight of his desperation. He didn't question why a tent would be pitched on a jagged ridge with no summit access. He only knew that inside that orange triangle, there was melted water, a radio, and heat. Julian. The voice was not a whisper. It was spoken at conversational volume, directly into his left ear. He snapped his head around, nearly losing his balance on the slick rock, but the space beside him was empty. It was Elias. It had to be. Elias had made it. Elias had set up camp and was calling him home. Julian tried to shout back to tell him he was coming, but his vocal cords were paralyzed by dehydration. Only a pitiful, dry hiss escaped his cracked lips. He began to move. He did not crawl. He dragged himself with a frantic, animalistic obsession, ignoring the fresh lacerations opening on his palms.
The distance was deceptive, stretching and contracting like an accordion. Minutes bled into hours. The sun hammered at the back of his neck, a relentless pressure that felt like a hot iron pressing against his brainstem. Every time he looked up, the orange shape was there, fluttering, promising salvation. He could see the guy lines now. He could see the shadow of movement inside. He reached the perimeter of the camp, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. With the last reserve of his strength, he lunged forward, his good hand reaching out to grab the nylon vestibule. His fingers met the rough, freezing surface of granite. The world snapped back into focus with a violence that nearly stopped his heart. There was no tent. There was no orange nylon. There was only a massive, lichen-stained boulder, shaped vaguely like a crouching man, illuminated by a trick of the sunlight hitting a vein of quartz. The hallucination evaporated, leaving him alone in the silence of the death zone. The despair was a physical weight, heavier than the rock itself, crushing the air out of his lungs. He collapsed against the base of the boulder, his cheek pressed against the unforgiving stone. Beside his head, in the shadow of the rock, lay a patch of old, dirty snow. It was hard-packed ice, really, littered with grit, but to Julian it looked like Timon's. Survival doctrine screamed at him to stop. Eating snow at this altitude was suicide. The energy required to melt the ice crystals in the stomach would drain his core body heat rapidly, accelerating hypothermia. It was a thermodynamic transaction he could not afford. But the logic of survival had been severed by the madness of thirst. He clawed a handful of the granular ice and shoved it into his mouth. The shock was immediate, a brain freeze headache that blinded him for a second, followed by a sharp, cramping pain in his gut as the freezing sludge hit his stomach. He didn't care. He clawed for more, his teeth grinding against the grit, swallowing the cold pain in greedy gulps.
He leaned back against the boulder, his body shivering violently as his internal temperature began to plummet, his eyes unfocused and glassy. "Just a sip," he whispered to the rock, patting its rough flank gently. The thermal shock of the snow in his stomach had settled into a heavy, leaden nausea, but the mountain itself was undergoing a different kind of transformation. The afternoon sun, piercing and relentless at this altitude, had begun to loosen the glacial glue that held the upper slopes together. For hours, the scree field had been silent, a graveyard of static stone, but now the temperature shift was waking the geology. It started with a sound that felt less like a noise and more like a vibration in the root of his teeth, a deep subterranean grinding of tectonic plates shifting weight. High above, a single stone, perhaps the size of a fist, detached from the ice pack and clattered down the sheer face. It struck a larger slab, dislodging it with a sharp report that echoed like a rifle shot across the valley. Julian looked up, squinting against the glare, and saw the terrifying physics of a chain reaction in motion. The entire upper moraine, a suspension of boulders and loose shale held in check only by frozen mud, was liquefying. Gravity took the reins. It wasn't a slide, it was a bombardment. Massive chunks of granite, some the size of compact cars, began to tumble in slow, chaotic arcs, gathering speed with every impact. They didn't roll smoothly, they bounced, erratic and lethal, shattering into shrapnel upon contact with the bedrock. Julian realized with a jolt of primal terror that he was sitting in the center of a geological bowling alley. There was no strategy to outrun this, not with a leg that felt like a bag of wet gravel. His only hope was the geometry of the slope itself. 30 feet to his right, a slab of slate jutted out from the mountainside, forming a narrow, dark lip of protection. He moved. He didn't think about the pain in his tibia or the exhaustion that had been courting him for days.
He scrambled on 3 limbs, clawing at the loose dirt, his fingernails tearing back to the quick as he hauled his body weight over the uneven ground. The air filled with a fine, choking powder that tasted of sulfur and crushed flint. The roar was deafening now, a continuous thunder that drowned out his own gasping breath, vibrating his chest cavity until he felt his heart might shake loose from its moorings. A boulder the size of a refrigerator smashed into the earth where he had been sitting seconds ago, obliterating the snowpatch and sending a spray of razor-sharp chips into his back. He threw himself under the overhang, curling into the tightest fetal ball his broken body would allow, pressing his face into the dirt. The mountain shed its skin above him. The noise was absolute, a physical assault that pressed against his eardrums until they popped. He could feel the impacts through the ground, heavy thuds that jarred his spine, threatening to collapse the very shelf that shielded him. Dust billowed into the crawlspace, thick and suffocating, coating his eyes and filling his throat with dry grit. And then, as quickly as the violence had erupted,
The heavy artillery ceased. The thunder tapered off into the skittering sound of smaller pebbles settling into new resting places. Julian lay paralyzed in the gloom, coughing up gray phlegm, afraid to move lest the vibration trigger a second wave. He was alive. The realization was slow, filtering through the shock. He patted his chest, checking for punctures, for blood, for anything missing. His hand brushed against his hip, searching for the reassuring contour of his plastic Nalgene bottle. His fingers met only a wet, mangled ruin. A stray rock, ricocheting off a slope, had struck his hip with surgical precision. The bottle was crushed, flattened against the rock, its precious contents, the last few ounces of liquid he possessed, soaking uselessly into the thirsty gray dust of his trousers. He stared at the damp patch on his leg, watching the moisture evaporate in the dry air, vanishing before he could even try to wring it out. The mountain hadn't killed him, but it had taken the only thing that mattered. He was now completely dry. The descent from the scree field was a blur of stumbling fatigue, driven by a thirst that had evolved from a nagging craving into a frantic, blinding necessity. The dust from the landslide still coated Julian's throat, a dry paste of pulverized granite that made every swallow feel like swallowing sandpaper. Below him, the valley floor opened up, a stark contrast to the gray death of the slopes above. A ribbon of turquoise wound through the low scrub, churning with a violence that belied its beauty. It was meltwater, fed directly from the ancient ice pack closer to the summit, and even from 50 yards away, he could smell the metallic tang of minerals ground into suspension. He didn't walk to the bank, he fell toward it, gravity pulling his dehydrated husk down the final embankment of slick moss and frozen mud. The water was deceptive. It wasn't the clear, sparkling liquid of a mountain spring, but a thick, opaque torrent of glacial flour, silt so fine it remained suspended, turning the river into a churning conveyor belt of liquid gray matter. Julian dropped to his knees, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the anticipation of relief. He leaned forward, cupping his hands to scoop the fluid, his center of gravity shifting precariously over the undercut bank. The moss beneath his left boot, lubricated by the spray, sheared away from the earth with a wet, tearing sound. There was no time to correct, no time to flail. He plunged chest deep into the torrent. The shock was instantaneous and absolute, a physical blow that seized his diaphragm and forced the air from his lungs in a strangled gasp. This wasn't water as he knew it. It was liquid nitrogen, a temperature so close to freezing that it felt like burning. The glacial silt acted like an abrasive, scrubbing the heat from his skin in seconds. He thrashed, his heavy boots searching for purchase on the slime-covered riverbed, his hands clawing at the muddy bank he had just fallen from. The current grabbed him, twisting his broken body, threatening to drag him under the ice shelf downstream.
With a roar of effort that tore at his vocal cords, he hauled himself up onto the grass, collapsing onto his side. He was out of the water, but the true nightmare had only just begun. He was wearing a high loft-down jacket, a piece of equipment designed to trap warm air between thousands of goose feathers. But down has a fatal flaw. When wet, it loses all structural integrity. The jacket, once his lifeline, instantly collapsed into a heavy, sodden shroud. The feathers clumped together, eliminating the air pockets, transforming the coat from an insulator into a heat sink. It was no longer keeping him warm. It was actively sucking the remaining thermal energy from his core to warm the freezing water trapped against his chest. The shivering started 10 seconds later. It wasn't the mild trembling of waiting for a bus in November. This was the violent, spasmodic rebellion of a dying metabolism, his jaw clamped shut with enough force to crack a molar, his teeth chattering a machine gun rhythm that echoed inside his skull. The convulsions started in his solar plexus and radiated outward, whipping his limbs against the hard ground. It felt as though an electrical current was surging through his spine, contracting every muscle fiber simultaneously. He curled inward, but the wet jacket clung to him like a leech, heavy and suffocating. If he stayed in the wet clothes, he would be dead in 20 minutes.
The logic of survival is cruel and counterintuitive. To survive the cold, he had to expose himself to it completely. His fingers, now numb and clumsy blocks of wood, fumbled with the zipper. It felt like trying to thread a needle wearing boxing gloves. He screamed in frustration, a jagged sound torn from his throat as he fought the wet fabric. He peeled the heavy, sodden shell from his body, the freezing air biting into his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. He stripped down to his skin, standing naked and vulnerable in the biting wind of the valley floor, his body shaking so violently he could barely stand. He had to wring the water out, physically force the moisture from the fabric before the sweat on his skin turned to ice.
The race against the lethal mathematics of thermodynamics had begun. The transition from the river valley was not a relief, but a descent into a slower, heavier form of hell. As Julian moved away from the violent clarity of the glacial water, the ground beneath his boots began to change character. The rocky scree gave way to a vast, high-altitude depression, a flat expanse of brownish-green moss that smelled of sulfur and ancient rot. The air here hung heavy and still, lacking the crisp bite of the peaks. It was a suffocating silence, broken only by the wet sighs of the earth as it compressed under his weight. The terrain was a lie. What appeared to be a solid meadow was actually a blanket of sphagnum moss floating over a deep, semi-liquid pit of peat. With every step, the ground rippled like a waterbed, the vibrations traveling outward in slow, nauseating waves. The suction began subtly, a slight tug at his heels, a reluctance of the mud to release his boot. But as he pushed forward, driven by the desperate need to cross the plateau before nightfall, the earth turned predatory. He misjudged a patch of dark sedge grass. He placed his weight on what he thought was a hummock, but the surface tension shattered instantly. He didn't fall, he sank. The ground simply ceased to exist, and he dropped to his waist in a fraction of a second. The muck was cold, a dense, viscous paste that collapsed around his hips and legs, vacuum sealing him in place. It wasn't like water, which displaced easily. This was a heavy, suffocating slurry of decomposing plant matter that weighed tons. The shock of the arrest jarred his spine, but the horror was in the stillness that followed. When he tried to lift his good leg, the bog refused to yield. The suction created a seal so perfect that lifting his foot felt like trying to pull a piston out of a seized engine block. Panic, usually a sharp spike of adrenaline, curdled into a heavy, leaden dread. He twisted his torso, trying to swim through the earth, but the movement only agitated.
The mud operated on non-Newtonian physics. The more violently he struggled, the harder and more unyielding it became. His broken leg, encased in the makeshift splint, was anchored deep in the sludge. The pressure on the fracture was excruciating, a dull, crushing vice that made his vision swim with black spots. He was burning his absolute last reserves of glycogen, his breath coming in ragged, weeping hitches. He stopped moving, his chest heaving against the surface of the mire. He began to weep, not with sorrow, but with the pure, incandescent rage of the helpless. He slammed his fists into the mud, screaming at the indifferent sky, his voice cracking under the strain of dehydration. Splatters of black slime coated his face, filling his mouth with the taste of decay. The bog absorbed his blows and his screams alike, offering no echo, no resistance, just an endless, apathetic absorption. He was drowning in earth, held fast by the decomposing remnants of 1,000,000 years of vegetation. If he didn't move now, he would become part of the peat. The calculus of survival demanded a sacrifice of flesh. He couldn't pull his legs straight out. The suction was too strong for his atrophied muscles to overcome. He needed leverage. He needed a fulcrum. He looked at the angle of his body and realized the sickening truth. He had to use his broken leg as a pry bar. He had to drive the shattered bone against the resistance of the mud to free his good side. He jammed his hands deep into the bog, finding purchase on a submerged root system that felt like wire. He squeezed his eyes shut. He drove the heel of his broken leg down, twisting the fracture, using the agony as a fuel source. A scream tore from his throat, a raw animal sound that frightened even him. The pain was blinding, white-hot and absolute, shattering his reality into fragments of red light. But beneath the scream, he felt the suction break. The mud released his left leg with a wet, flat popping sound. He didn't stop.
Riding the wave of torture, he dragged himself belly down across the moss, clawing at the grass,
pulling his ruined body inch, an agonizing inch, until he lay on solid ground, encased in a shell of black, stinking mud. The peat bog was behind him, a black scar on the landscape, but its residue clung to him like a second necrotic skin. As the high-altitude sun began to burn through the thin atmosphere, the layer of slime coating Julian's body began to dry. It contracted as it hardened, pulling tight against his sunburned flesh, sealing his pores and turning every movement into a battle against friction. He had dragged himself onto a shelf of gray shale away from the soft earth, seeking the stability of stone. But with stability came exposure. There was no cover here, only the raw, abrasive wind and the blinding clarity of the light. He was no longer moving with purpose. He was vibrating with the tremors of terminal exhaustion. It was the silence that alerted him first. The wind had dropped, and the usual ambient noise of the scrubland, the rustle of ichu grass, the distant shifting of gravel had ceased. The world held its breath. Julian rolled onto his back, his breath rattling in a chest that felt like it was filled with crushed glass. He looked up, expecting the empty blue void. Instead, he saw the orbit. High above, 3 black specks cut lazy circular geometries against the sky. They were Andean condors, masters of efficiency, riding the thermals without a single beat of their wings. They were not hunting. They were waiting for the inevitable conclusion of his struggle. He was being assessed. To them, he was no longer a man. He was a calorie deposit waiting to expire. He tried to sit up, but his vision grayed out, the horizon tilting dangerously. When his sight cleared, he saw he was not alone on the ground. 20 yards away, perched on a jagged outcrop of rock, sat a colpio fox. It was larger than he expected, its coat a dusty mix of red and gray that blended perfectly with the shale. It didn't bare its teeth. It didn't growl. It simply watched him with amber eyes that held a terrifying, placid intelligence.
The animal sat on its haunches, comfortable and patient, tracking the rise and fall of Julian's chest. It knew the math of the wild. The energy cost of killing him was high, but the energy cost of waiting for him to die was 0. Julian felt a surge of indignation that burned hotter than the infection in his leg. He scoured the ground around him, his fingers trembling as they closed around a fist-sized chunk of slate. He tried to shout, but his throat was a parched ruin, producing only a dry rasp. With a grunt of effort, he hurled the stone. It was a pathetic throw, lacking velocity or aim, clattering harmlessly onto the rocks 10 feet short of the target. The fox didn't run. It didn't even stand up. It merely watched the stone settle, then returned its gaze to Julian's face. The lack of fear was a judgment. The exertion cost him everything. The adrenaline faded, leaving a vacuum that was instantly filled by a crushing, narcotic heaviness. His eyelids felt weighted with lead. He knew the danger of sleep. He knew it was the precursor to the end, but his biology rebelled against his will. The pain in his leg dulled into a distant throb, and the warmth of the sun on his face felt seductive, a gentle blanket promising peace. His head lolled back against the stone. The darkness encroached from the edges of his vision, soft and inviting. He drifted, floating in the space between existence and oblivion. He awoke to a sharp, inquisitive pressure on his left foot. For a second, his mind couldn't process the sensation. It was rhythmic. Tap, tap, tear. He crocked his eyes open, his vision blurry and swimming. A mountain caracara, a raptor with dark plumage and a bright, cruel beak, was standing on the toe of his boot. It wasn't attacking, it was prospecting. It pecked at the leather, then hopped up onto his shin, its talons digging into the dried mud and the bruised flesh beneath. It tilted its head, looking directly into Julian's open eye with a reptilian lack of empathy. It was checking for a reflex. It was waiting for the meat to stop twitching. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was being eaten alive.
The horror bypassed his rational mind and struck the lizard brain at the base of his skull. This wasn't the clean death of a fall or the cold death of the night.
This was the humiliation of becoming fodder while still conscious. A surge of primal electricity, sharper and more potent than any drug, flooded his atrophied muscles. He didn't just move, he exploded upward. He unleashed a sound that tore his vocal cords. It wasn't a word, it was a feral, guttural shriek of defiance, a rejection of the food chain. He thrashed violently, swinging his arms, kicking out with his good leg. The caracara launched itself into the air with a startled rustle of feathers, screeching in protest. The fox on the ridge stood up, ears flattened, finally unnerved by the resurrection of the corpse. Julian sat upright, chest heaving, screaming at the empty air, screaming at the fox, screaming at the condors circling above. He told them in a language of pure rage that he was not meat, not yet. The rage that had scattered the scavengers burned out as quickly as a match in a gale, leaving Julian with nothing but the sour, hollow ache of a stomach that had begun to digest its own lining. He crested the final ridge, his boots scraping heavily against the loose shale, dragging his injured leg like a dead weight. The plateau opened up before him, a flat expanse of wind-scoured earth where the base camp had been established weeks ago. He had pinned his entire existence on this coordinate, constructing a fantasy of rescue, of Elias waiting with a fire and a medkit. The plateau was empty. There were no orange nylon domes snapping in the wind, no smoke curling from a cookstove, no silhouette of a man waving him down. The only evidence that humanity had ever touched this desolate place were the geometric scars left on the ground. 3 squares of flattened, yellowed grass marked where the tents had stood, looking like bruises on the landscape. A neat pile of stones marked a cold fire pit, the ash long since scattered by the relentless Andean gusts. Elias was gone.
The calculation had been made, the timeline expired, and the extraction initiated without him. Julian stood swaying in the silence, the wind stripping the heat from his sweat-soaked clothes, realizing that the silence here was heavier than the silence in the ravine. This was the silence of abandonment. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but because his hamstrings simply ceased to function. His eyes scanned the dirt with the manic intensity of a drug addict. He wasn't looking for a note or a map. He was looking for trash. In the civilized world, garbage is waste. Here, it was the only potential source of energy left in the universe. He crawled forward, his hands raking through the dry scrub, turning over rocks and sifting through the dust. He found a crushed cigarette butt, the filter stained brown, and instinctively brought it to his nose, inhaling the steel tobacco scent before discarding it. It offered no calories. He needed fuel. He needed to stop the trembling that was rattling his teeth in his skull. 20 yards from the tent sites, the earth had been disturbed and mounded back up in a hasty, oblong heap. It was the latrine pit. The standard protocol for the expedition was to burn the trash and bury the waste in a single trench before striking camp. Julian dragged himself toward the mound of loose dirt, the smell hitting him before he reached the edge. It was a vile bouquet of ammonia, charred plastic, and decaying organic matter, but his revulsion had atrophied days ago. His survival instinct had cannibalized his dignity. He dug his fingers into the soft, foul soil, scooping away the top layer of dirt to reveal the stratum of refuse beneath. He was digging through the excrement of men who had left him behind. His hands, blackened and shaking, pushed aside a melted plastic bottle and a wad of soiled toilet paper that had only partially burned. He was weeping now, silent tears that cut clean tracks through the grime on his face, but he didn't stop digging. He sifted through the ash and filth until his fingers brushed against something distinct, a texture that wasn't rock or plastic. It was a clump of matter, fused together by heat and moisture.
He pulled it into the light. It was a plastic bag of rolled oats, half melted and split open. The contents spilled out and mixed with the gray ash of the fire. The oats were gray, clumped together with soot and likely contaminated by the proximity to the human waste, but to Julian they represented life. He didn't hesitate. He didn't brush them off. He scooped the handful of grit, ash, and grain into his mouth. The taste was abominable, a dry, choking mixture of charcoal and rot that instantly coated his tongue and throat. He gagged, his stomach convulsing in protest, but he clamped a hand over his mouth, forcing the muscles of his throat to swallow. He forced the filth down, dry heaving as the bolus hit his stomach,
terrified he would lose the precious calories. He sat back on his heels, his hands covered in muck, chewing on the second handful. There was no man left in the hollow of the plateau. There was only a biological machine refueling itself with the refuse of the living. The caloric burst from the scavenged oats burned through his system in minutes, a fleeting spark in a dying engine. Julian found the cut in the earth shortly after leaving the plateau, a jagged scar carved into the mountainside by heavy machinery decades ago. It was a mining access road, a ribbon of compacted granite and sharp, angular gravel that wound its way down toward the distant valley floor. It was the artery to salvation. But looking at it, Julian realized with cold, mathematical certainty that his geometry for travel had changed. Verticality was no longer an option. The structural integrity of his right leg had finally collapsed. The infection in his knee had breached the joint capsule, swelling the limb to the size of a melon. The skin was pulled so tight it appeared translucent and shiny, pulsing with a radiant, feverish heat that he could feel even through the fabric of his trousers. The leg would not bend, and it certainly would not bear weight. He tried to hop, but the vibration traveled up the bone like a lightning strike, short-circuiting his vision. He dropped to his elbows.
The descent became a study in friction and abrasion. Every inch forward required him to drag his dead weight over stones that had been crushed into jagged shards, specifically designed to provide traction for tires, not human flesh. The fabric of his sleeves disintegrated within the first hour, leaving his skin exposed to the abrasive gray teeth of the road. He didn't feel the cuts immediately. The nerves in his forearms were overwhelmed by the screaming agony in his leg, which throbbed in sync with his erratic heartbeat. He was an amphibian now, pulling himself forward with a swimming motion, his chin scraping the dust. A wet, erratic line followed him down the mountain. It was a mixture of dark oxidized blood from his shredded elbows and the yellow-green discharge leaking from the weeping fissures in his knee. He was literally leaving pieces of himself behind, eroding like the landscape around him. The smell was distinct, not the metallic tang of fresh blood, but the sickly sweet fermentation odor of necrotic tissue. His body was decomposing while he was still inhabiting it, the biological alarms ringing so loudly in his brain that they drowned out the wind. Consciousness became a strobe light. The horizon would tilt violently, the gray gravel rushing up to meet his face, and then the world would vanish into black static. He didn't sleep. His system simply powered down to preserve the last watts of energy. Each reboot was triggered not by rest, but by a spike of pain sharp enough to pierce the veil of shock. He would wake with his cheek pressed against the stones, dried saliva cementing his beard to the dirt. The sun had moved 10 degrees across the sky. He rolled onto his back, the movement sending a fresh wave of nausea rolling through his gut. He lifted his left arm, the wrist looking like a brittle twig wrapped in parchment, and focused his blurring eyes on the scratched face of his watch. It had been 4 days. The transition from the mountain to the outskirts of the settlement was not marked by a sign, but by a shift in the olfactory landscape. The clean, biting sterility of the high-altitude wind was suddenly choked by the heavy, oily stench of unrefined coal smoke and wet dog fur. Julian's boots, now stripped of their treads and held together by dried mud, slapped against the compacted slurry of a village street. The gravel was gone, replaced by a sucking, freezing mud that threatened to pull his feet out from under him with every lurching step. He was no longer crawling. He was falling forward in a series of arrested collapses, his center of gravity an erratic pendulum swinging wildly with the throbbing weight of his ruined leg. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness between the shacks. The local mongrels sensed him before he saw them. They did not bark immediately. Instead, a low, vibrating growl rippled through the freezing air, a primal frequency that triggered the atrophied fight-or-flight response in Julian's lizard brain. He was an intruder, a thing that smelled of death and rot, an affront to the living ecosystem of the village. A sudden eruption of noise shattered the silence as a chain rattled violently against a post, followed by the savage, rhythmic snapping of jaws. The aggression was a physical force, pushing him away, but his eyes were locked on a single glowing rectangle 50 yards ahead. A window, a warm yellow square of artificial light. He collided with the rough-hewn timber of the porch, the impact knocking the wind out of his bruised ribs. He slid down the wood, his fingernails digging into the grain,
until he was a heap of rags and fever on the welcome mat. Through the thin wood of the door, vibrations transferred into his skull. It was a voice, low, mournful, and terrified. He knew that cadence. He knew the pitch. It was Elias, the man who had cut the rope. Julian tried to shout, to announce his survival, but his throat was a dry canyon capable only of producing a rattling wheeze. He lifted a hand that looked more like a claw, the fingers black with frostbite and grime, and dragged his nails down the painted wood of the door. It wasn't a knock. It was the frantic, weak scratching of an animal dying in the cold. The voice inside stopped. Heavy footsteps vibrated the floorboards beneath Julian's cheek.
The latch clicked, the sound distinct and metallic, echoing like a gunshot in the night. The door swung inward, and the world exploded into blinding white. The heat that rushed out was a physical blow, carrying the scent of tobacco and roasted meat, aromas that made Julian's empty stomach spasm violently. He squinted up, his eyes watering against the sudden brilliance. Elias stood there, framed by the light, a mug of coffee halfway to his mouth. The mug slipped from his fingers. It shattered on the floorboards, sending dark liquid splashing across Julian's boots, but neither man flinched. Elias did not step forward to embrace the friend he had lost. He recoiled. He stumbled back into the hallway, his face draining of blood until he was as pale as the snow outside. His eyes were wide, fixed not on a survivor, but on a revenant. He was looking at a corpse that had refused to stay buried, a skeletal horror draped in tattered gore, reeking of gangrene and the grave. The guilt on Elias's face was not washed away by relief. It was calcified by sheer terror. Julian forced his head up, the muscles in his neck screaming. He looked into the eyes of the man who had severed the thread between them. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for help. He summoned the last reserve of oxygen from his collapsing lungs, shaping the air into a single, rasping syllable that cut through the silence like a serrated blade. 2. The darkness finally accepted him. The yellow light swirled into a vortex, the face of his friend distorting into a mask of anguish, and Julian let go. He fell forward across the threshold, not into safety, but into the unknown abyss of a future that might be worse than the mountain he had conquered.